Good evening. The dock workers of Messina arrived before sunrise, as they always did. It was October of 1347. The morning was cold, and the sea was the color of old iron, and 12 Genoese ships had drifted into the harbor from the Black Sea, with their sails hanging limp and their ropes trailing in the water. The workers walked toward the ships. They called out. No one answered. When they drew close enough to see, they stopped walking. Most of the sailors aboard were dead. Those still alive were barely recognizable as men, covered in dark swellings at the neck, the armpit, the groin, the size of eggs, some the size of apples, weeping blood and pus into their clothes. They lay in their own filth. They made sounds that were not quite words. The ship smelled of something the workers would not be able to name until much later, because they had never smelled it before. Not on this scale. The smell of a city dying. The authorities of Messina ordered the ships expelled from the harbor immediately. The sailors were driven back to their vessels at the point of a sword. The ships were pushed back out to sea, but it was already too late. Something had stepped off those ships before anyone gave the order. Something with no face and no name and no intention. Something that, in the weeks and months and years ahead, would silence half the known world. Before we go further, if these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history help you find rest, take a moment to like and subscribe before you close your eyes. That way, this place will always be here for you, waiting in the dark. Then drop a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. It moves me every time how many corners of the earth gather here to listen. Now, dim the lights a little more. Set your phone face down and let us begin. There is a temptation, when speaking of the Black Death, to frame it as something medieval, something that belongs to a world of superstition and candlelight and ignorance, a catastrophe that could only have happened to people who did not know better, who could not see what was coming, a fairy tale of suffering safely enclosed in the distant past. It was not that. What arrived in Messina in October of 1347 was not a fairy tale. It was a piece of biological machinery so precise, so ruthlessly efficient in its design, that even now, nearly 700 years later, scientists study it with something close to awe. It was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, and before we speak of the human beings it destroyed, we need to understand what it actually was, because the horror of the Black Death is not diminished by understanding it. If anything, the understanding makes it worse. Yersinia pestis is a small, rod-shaped organism, invisible to the naked eye, unremarkable if you could see it, in any meaningful sense. It has no malice. It has no awareness. It does not know what a human being is, or what a city is, or what the word death means. It is simply a bacterium doing what bacteria do, finding a host, consuming resources, replicating, spreading. It is, in that sense, no different from the bacterium responsible for a sore throat or a stomachache, except for what it does inside a human body and how extraordinary it is at doing it. To understand that, we need to go back much further than 1347, back to the place where Yersinia pestis had lived for thousands of years before it ever met a human being, the vast, treeless grasslands of Central Asia, the steppe. Imagine a silence so complete it has a physical weight, a landscape stretching in every direction without interruption, low hills, dry grasses, the occasional shallow lake glinting in the cold. This was, and remains, one of the most sparsely populated places on Earth. But beneath it, in the complex labyrinthine burrow systems of the steppe's true residents, the marmots, the gerbils, the great-toothed sosliks, something very old had been living in a kind of stable, invisible equilibrium. For thousands of years, Yersinia pestis existed in these rodent populations as what scientists call an endemic infection. That is, it was always there, a constant low-level hum of mortality cycling through the burrow colonies. Rodents would contract it and die. Fleas would carry it from body to body. The colony would absorb the loss, and the cycle would continue. It was brutal in the way that all ecological cycles are brutal, but it was contained. The steppe kept it secret. The bacterium had no reason to go anywhere else. The mechanism of that cycle is one of elegant, terrible simplicity. A flea, specifically the oriental rat flea, Xenepsilla chiopis, though it was not alone in this work, would bite an infected rodent and take a blood meal teeming with Yersinia pestis. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria would begin to multiply. And here is where something extraordinary and dreadful happened. The bacteria would multiply so rapidly, so densely, that they would form a thick, dark, gelatinous blockage in the flea's foregut, a plug of compressed, living organisms that prevented food from passing through. The flea could not digest. The flea could not feed. The flea was, in a biological sense, starving to death, even as it continued to eat. And so the flea became frantic, desperate, biting again and again and again with a compulsive, unquenchable aggression, driven by a hunger it could never satisfy. But with each bite, each attempt to feed, the flea would regurgitate. The blockage in its gut would force the blood and the bacteria back out of its mouth directly into the wound it had just made, into the bloodstream of whatever creature it had bitten. This is how Yersinia pestis traveled, not through the air, not through intention, not through malice, and through a flea that could not stop being hungry. What the bacterium did next, once inside a human being, was systematic in a way that still disturbs the scientists who study it. The entry wound was typically on the leg or arm, wherever the flea had found exposed skin. From there, the bacteria did not simply multiply in place. They traveled, moving through the body's lymphatic system, the network of vessels and nodes that the immune system uses to filter and fight infection. The bacteria drifted, carried by lymph fluid, toward the nearest lymph node. The groin, if the bite was on the leg. The armpit, if it was on the arm. The neck, if the bite was somewhere on the upper body. And at that lymph node, they stopped. And they began to grow. Inner Yersinia pestis had evolved a remarkable capacity, the ability to suppress the immune system's initial response. When the body's defensive cells, the macrophages, the neutrophils, arrived to engulf and destroy the intruder, the bacteria evaded them. They survived inside the very cells sent to kill them. They used those cells as vehicles, traveling deeper into the lymph node, hiding from the immune system within the immune system itself. And once safely inside the node, they erupted, multiplying at astonishing speed, filling the node with billions of copies of themselves, producing toxins that killed surrounding tissue. The node swelled. It hardened. It became an agonizing, dark, tense mass beneath the skin, warm to the touch, visible through the surface. The swelling the people of 1347 would come to call the bubo. This is where the word bubonic comes from bubo, from swelling. The experience of those first days was described, by those who survived to describe it, as a sudden freezing chill, the skin going cold even as the fever was rising, the body registering something profoundly wrong before the mind understood what was happening. Then the pain, the swelling appearing within 2 to 6 days of the bite, growing rapidly, some reaching the size of an orange. Sometimes the skin over the bubo darkened, bruised and blackened as the blood vessels beneath hemorrhaged. Sometimes the swelling would burst, releasing a thick, foul discharge. This was, in the grim mathematics of medieval survival, actually the better outcome. A bubo that burst and drained gave the body a chance to fight back. A bubo that did not burst was almost certainly fatal, because if the bacteria were not contained, if the lymph node could not hold them, they moved on. Septicemic plague was what happened when Yersinia pestis broke through the lymph node and entered the bloodstream. This was faster than bubonic plague, in some cases catastrophically fast. The bacteria would spread through the blood to every organ simultaneously: the liver, the spleen, the lungs, the brain. The skin would begin to turn dark in patches as the blood vessels beneath it hemorrhaged and died. Small purple and black spots would appear across the body, spreading and merging. The extremities would turn black. This is the origin, historians believe, of the name the disease would eventually acquire: the Black Death. Not the black of superstition or the black of medieval metaphor, but the literal blackening of living human skin. And death from septicemic plague could come in hours. It could come so quickly that people went to bed in apparent health and were found dead in the morning, their bodies already showing the marks. This happened. It was witnessed. It was written down by people who could not quite believe what they were writing. And then there was a third form, the one the people of medieval Europe feared most, even if they did not understand why. Because they could not see the mechanism, they could only see the dying. Pneumonic plague. This is what happened when the bacteria reached the lungs. And once they did, the rules of the disease changed entirely. Bubonic plague required a flea. Septicemic plague required the blood, but pneumonic plague required only breath. The bacteria were expelled with every cough, every exhaled breath, or suspended in tiny droplets of moisture in the air. A person with pneumonic plague could infect everyone around them simply by existing in the same room. The incubation period was as short as 24 hours. Without treatment, and there was no treatment, not in 1347, not for decades and centuries after, pneumonic plague was 100% fatal. Every single person who developed it died. This, then, was the machine that boarded those 12 Genoese ships in Kaffa, a port city on the northern coast of the Black Sea, sometime in 1346. The story of how it got there is itself worth a moment of quiet consideration. In the early 1340s, a great Mongol army under a Khan named Jani Beg had been besieging Kaffa, a prosperous trading post operated by Genoese merchants. It was a prolonged siege, fierce and frustrating, and then something strange began to happen to the Mongol forces. The men were falling ill, dying rapidly in large numbers in ways that terrified even hardened soldiers. The swellings, the blackening, the sudden deaths in the night. Jani Beg couldn't break the city's walls, but he had already lost the siege in his own mind, and he did something that has echoed through the history of biological warfare ever since. He ordered the corpses of his plague dead loaded into catapults, and he threw them over the walls of Kaffa. The Genoese merchants inside the city watched this happening with a horror they could not fully articulate. They dragged the bodies away. They tried to throw them back into the sea, But by then, it was too late. The plague was inside the walls of Kaffa, and the Genoese merchants, recognizing the city as lost, it did what merchants do. They loaded their ships and they fled. They fled west, along the trade routes they knew, toward home. They stopped at Constantinople. They stopped at ports along the eastern Mediterranean. They carried their goods. They carried their rats. They carried their fleas. And the fleas carried their bacteria. And by the time they reached Messina in October of 1347, with their dead sailors and their dying ones and the dark ships drifting against the harbor walls, by that point the machine had already been running for months. Messina was simply where Europe opened its eyes. The Sicilian authorities expelled the ships, as we know, but expelling a ship is not the same as expelling a bacterium. Yersinia pestis does not need a harbor. It does not need a ship or a sailor or a permission to enter. It needs only a rat and a flea and a warm body to bite. And Messina had plenty of all three. Within days, the city was sick. Within weeks, social order was beginning to fracture. People who had been perfectly healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall. Physicians who went near the sick did not return. Priests who administered last rites began to die themselves. And the people of Messina did what frightened people have always done and will always do. They ran. They loaded carts and horses and whatever they could carry, and they fled into the Sicilian countryside and into other cities and onto other ships. And Yersinia pestis, patient, purposeful in its purposelessness, as efficient as any machine ever built, went with them. Europe would never be the same again. But that story, the story of how the silence spread, from Messina to Florence to Paris to London, from the warm south to the frozen north, that story belongs to the next passage of this quiet night. For now, rest for a moment in the understanding of what it was. A thing without a mind, a thing without malice, a thing so small it cannot be seen, doing nothing more or less than what it had always done for thousands of years in the burrows of the Central Asian steppe. It was not the end of the world. It only felt that way. Close your eyes for just a moment if you like. We have time. There is a map, if you look for it, that historians have reconstructed from death records and church archives and municipal documents. Those dusty, ink-stained ledgers that somehow survived the very catastrophe they were recording. It shows the spread of the Black Death across Europe between 1347 and 1351, rendered in dates and arrows and shaded regions. It is a clinical document. It is precise. It is, if you allow yourself to look at it properly, one of the most terrifying things ever drawn. Because what the map shows is not a disaster radiating from a single point. It shows a wave, a slow, inexorable, continent-wide wave, moving at the speed of trade routes and shipping lanes and the ordinary rhythms of human commerce. It moved the way news moved in the 14th century, the way grain moved and wool and silk and spices. It followed the roads that merchants had built over centuries, the sea lanes that sailors had memorized over generations. It turned every achievement of human connectivity, every bridge, every harbor, every well-worn mountain pass, into a corridor for its own advancement. It took approximately 4 years to cross Europe, and behind it, it left silence. From Messina, the plague moved to mainland Italy within weeks of those first terrible October days. And the mechanisms were the same as they had always been. Frightened people carrying it with them as they fled, rats and fleas aboard the ships that the port authorities of one city after another futilely tried to turn away. By January of 1348, it had reached Genoa and Venice simultaneously. By February, it was in Pisa. By March, it had entered Florence. Florence, in the spring of 1348, was one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe. A city of perhaps 85,000 people, prosperous, literate, cosmopolitan by the standards of its age, home to artists and bankers and merchants and scholars. Giovanni Boccaccio was living there. He survived, and what he wrote about what he witnessed in those months became one of the most haunting documents in the history of human literature. He wrote of streets filling with the dead. He wrote of people dropping in the roads, in the markets, in their own doorways. The suddenness of it, the sheer indiscriminate speed of the dying, defying any attempt the mind made to impose order or meaning. He wrote of a city losing its rituals, the rituals that had always surrounded death, the prayers, the mourning, the careful preparation of the body, the procession to the church, the burial with its proper rites. These things dissolved first. There was simply no time for them. There were too many dead, coming too quickly, for the living to honor each one. In Florence, it is estimated that 50,000 of the city's 85,000 people died, more than half. A Sienese chronicler named Agnolo di Tura wrote something that has survived 7 centuries precisely because no one who reads it ever forgets it. He wrote that he buried his 5 children with his own hands, that he could find no one else to do it, that there were so many dead in Siena that people said and believed that it was the end of the world. He noted with a plainness that is more devastating than any elaboration could be, that nobody wept. There were no tears. The suffering had moved past the point where tears were a meaningful response to it. Venice lost 2/3 of its population. Siena lost so many of its citizens, and among them so many of its painters, its craftsmen, its architects, that the great expansion of the Siena Cathedral, begun with such ambition and pride just years before, was simply abandoned. The scaffolding came down. The half-finished walls stood open to the sky. They stand, in parts, that way still. The plague reached Rome in August of 1348, and it reached Naples. It spread south through the Italian peninsula and simultaneously northwest, following the shipping lanes out of Genoa and Venice and the smaller ports of Liguria. Not long after it struck Messina, the Black Death was already in Marseille. By the spring of 1348, it had entered France, and France in the 14th century was the most populous country in Western Europe, with a complex web of roads and rivers and market towns connecting its cities. The plague followed every one of them. It moved from Marseille up the Rhone Valley toward Lyon. It spread along the coast toward Spain. By June of 1348, it had reached Paris. Paris, at peak, was burying 800 people a day. 800 every day. The gravediggers worked without stopping, and still the bodies accumulated. Mass graves were opened in the fields outside the city walls, long trenches into which the dead were laid in layers, lime scattered between them, the trenches filled in and new ones begun. The smell, by all accounts, was everywhere. It entered the houses. It settled on the streets. It became simply part of what Paris was, in those months, a city that smelled of its own ending. By mid-1348, the plague had crossed the English Channel. It arrived in the southwest of England in Dorset, probably through the port of Melcombe Regis, in the summer of that year. London fell in the autumn. The English death toll is difficult to calculate with precision because the record-keeping itself collapsed along with so much else. But historians estimate that somewhere between a third and half of England's entire population died in the first wave. In the city of London alone, the death toll was catastrophic. Churchyards were overwhelmed within weeks. The Bishop of Bath and Wells, one Ralph of Shrewsbury, issued a letter, a document that still exists, granting lay people permission to confess to one another, since there were no longer enough priests to hear confession. He noted, with a kind of desperate pastoral pragmatism, that even a woman would do, if no man was available. By 1349, the plague was in Germany. By 1350, Scandinavia. By 1351, it had reached the eastern edge of Europe, into Russia. The 4-year wave had crossed a continent. But the numbers, the millions dead, the cities halved, the populations shattered. The numbers are almost too large to hold in the mind. They become abstract. They become statistics. And statistics do not tell you what it was actually like to live inside that silence. What it was like, according to the people who wrote about it, was above all a dissolution of the ordinary things that made a life recognizable. Waking in the morning and knowing your neighbors, walking to the market and haggling over prices, hearing the church bells mark the hours, seeing the same faces in the same streets year after year. These things, one by one, began to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, quietly, like candles being extinguished in a very large room. Boccaccio wrote that people in Florence came to avoid one another, not out of malice, but out of fear, that neighbors did not visit neighbors, that, in some cases, parents abandoned sick children, that children abandoned sick parents. He did not write this as condemnation. He was careful, deliberate about this, but as observation, as a record of what fear does to human beings when it becomes absolute. When the cost of love becomes death, some people, many people, stop paying it. And this, in its quiet way, was perhaps the most disturbing thing about the Black Death. Not just that it killed so many people, but that it made the survivors afraid of each other. In the countryside, the silence was different, more complete. In England, scholars have counted approximately 1,000 villages that were depopulated during the Black Death, settlements that were reduced to a few desperate survivors, or to none at all, their names vanishing from the tax records and the church registers, their buildings slowly falling back into the earth. A traveller moving through the English countryside in 1349 or 1350 might walk for hours through farmland that had been worked and tended for generations, fields that should have been full of people at this time of year, ploughing or planting or tending livestock, and find nothing. Empty houses, doors standing open, cattle wandering untended in fields where no one had come to milk them, dogs that had reverted to something half-wild, foraging among the ruins of the villages that had fed them. The bells had stopped. That is something several chroniclers mentioned, in different countries, in different languages, as if it was the detail they could not stop thinking about. The church bells, which had rung the canonical hours every day of their lives, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, had stopped ringing. There was no one left to ring them. Or the ones who remained had stopped caring what hour it was, because the hours had ceased to mean anything. because tomorrow was indistinguishable from today, and today was another day of carrying bodies and waiting to see who would be next. The town of Eyam in Derbyshire, a village that would face its own terrible encounter with plague 3 centuries later in 1665, had neighboring settlements that simply ceased to exist, gone from the records, gone from the landscape. The land healed over them, the grass grew back, the silence settled permanently. This is what 50 million deaths looks like at human scale. Not a number, not a statistic, a bell that stops ringing. There is one more quality of the silence worth understanding, because it shaped everything that came after. The responses, as the explanations, the desperate attempts to make meaning from meaninglessness. The pneumonic form of the plague was spreading through the air of these cities and these villages, not only through flea bites. And no one in 1348 knew this. No one knew what a bacterium was. No one had a microscope. No one understood germ theory. The people of medieval Europe watched their cities die, and they could see no cause. They could not trace the invisible thread connecting one death to the next. They watched a person collapse in the market who had been perfectly healthy at dawn, and they could not explain it. They watched families die in sequence, father, then mother, then children, and they could not explain the pattern. They watched entire streets go silent, house by house, and they could not explain why this street and not that one, or why this family and not their neighbors. The silence had no face. When suffering has no face, the human mind does not rest. It searches, it reaches, it builds explanations out of whatever materials are available. Theology, astrology, fear, and the ancient human need to find an order in the chaos. Even if the order it finds is wrong, even if the order it finds is monstrous. What medieval Europe reached for, in its confusion and its terror, would tell us a great deal about what human beings do when science fails them and the dying does not stop. The University of Paris, the most prestigious center of learning in Europe, issued a formal report in 1348. Commissioned by the King of France, this document represented the considered judgment of the finest medical minds of the age. It concluded with absolute confidence that the cause of the plague was a malign conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius on the 20th of March, 1345. The corrupted air this conjunction had produced, the miasma, the poisoned atmosphere, had drifted south and east and into the bodies of the living. This was the official explanation. This was what the experts said. And this, more than anything else, tells us where Europe stood in the autumn of 1348. Standing at the edge of the largest catastrophe in its history, with no tools capable of understanding it, no framework capable of containing it, no language adequate to describe what was happening, and reaching, in its desperation, for the only explanations it had. Medicine had its answer. The stars were wrong. Religion had its answer. God was angry. Neither answer would save a single life. And the people dying in the doorways of Florence and Paris and London did not know yet that both answers were catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. They could not know. That knowledge was still centuries away. What they had was the silence, and each other, and the growing certainty that whatever this was, it was not going to stop on its own. The machine, with no malice and no mind, had no reason to stop. It had only just begun to show what it could do. In the next passage of this night, we will descend into the world of those who are supposed to have answers. the physicians in their long robes, carrying their incense and their charts of the humors, the plague doctors in their beak-nosed masks, walking through the charnel houses of Europe with small sticks, because they had been advised not to touch the sick. The scholars of medicine, clutching their Galenic texts with growing desperation, prescribing bloodletting to people whose blood was already killing them. The most educated people in Europe, armed with centuries of accumulated knowledge, and not one of them, not a single one, had the faintest idea what was actually happening. Rest easy for a moment if you can. We are moving deeper into the dark. There is a particular quality to the suffering of someone who dies at the hands of medicine that is meant to save them. It is a different thing from dying of the disease alone. It carries with it something almost unbearable, a layer of additional tragedy, quiet and easily overlooked in the larger catastrophe, but present. The knowledge, if they had possessed it, that the person standing over them with the lancet and the leeches and the absolute certainty of a trained professional was not helping them, was, in some cases, making things decisively worse. The physicians of 14th century Europe were not charlatans. That is the important thing to understand before we go any further. They were not frauds. They were not ignorant men pretending to knowledge they did not possess. They were, by the standards of their time and place, the most rigorously educated professionals in the world. They had studied for years. They had read everything available to read. They had sat at the feet of masters who had themselves sat at the feet of masters in an unbroken chain of learning stretching back to the great physicians of antiquity. They believed, with complete sincerity, in everything they prescribed. That is what makes it so devastating, because every single thing they believed was wrong. To understand the medicine of 1348, you have to understand a man who died more than 1,000 years before the Black Death arrived in Messina. His name was Galen. He was a Greek-Roman physician, born in 129 CE, and he was, without question, one of the most brilliant minds of the ancient world. His observations were meticulous. His writings were voluminous. His influence on Western medicine was so complete, so total, so reverently maintained across the centuries between his death and the 14th century, that his ideas had calcified from theory into something approaching religious law. Galen believed that the human body was governed by 4 fluids: the humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health was the proper balance of these 4 substances. Disease was imbalance. And the treatment of disease was therefore, logically, the restoration of balance by removing whatever humor was in excess or by introducing whatever was in deficit. This is a framework of considerable internal elegance. It explains almost everything, if you allow yourself to believe its premises. A fever? Too much blood, the hot, wet humor. Draw off the blood and the fever should subside. A cough? Too much phlegm, the cold, wet humor. Prescribe something hot and dry to correct the imbalance. The plague buboes with their angry heat and their swelling. An excess of blood and corrupt humor concentrated in the lymph nodes. The treatment was clear. Bleed the patient, lance the swelling, restore equilibrium. That this treatment killed people. That bleeding a patient already weakened by septicemia accelerated their death. That lancing an infected bubo with an unsterilized instrument introduced additional bacteria into an already overwhelmed immune system was not something Galen could have known. Germ theory was not proposed until the 19th century. In bacteria would not be identified as the agents of disease, until Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur in the 1860s and 1870s established the principles that the physicians of 1348 lacked entirely. In the absence of that knowledge, bloodletting made complete sense. It had been practiced for centuries. Galen himself had reportedly survived a bout of plague through its application. Or so the story went, repeated down through generations of physicians as a proof of the method's efficacy. Treatises specified not merely that bloodletting should be performed, but precisely where on the body, in what quantity, at what phase of the moon, under what astrological conditions. An encyclopedia from a monastery in Cambridgeshire warned practitioners solemnly not to perform bloodletting on days divisible by 5. The science of the 14th century was thorough, detailed, internally consistent, and built upon a foundation of total misapprehension. The leeches came next when the lancet had done its work. Placed along the swollen lymph nodes, along the neck, the armpit, the groin, wherever the buboes had formed, the leeches were meant to draw off the corrupt excess. Patients who could afford it paid premium prices for the services of leech collectors, a highly specialized trade in medieval Europe, because the best leeches were not cheap, and the physicians who applied them charged accordingly. People bankrupted themselves for this treatment. They lay in their beds in the firelit dark, with leeches fixed to their necks and their armpits, and they believed, because the most educated men in the world had told them so, that they were being helped. They were not being helped. The miasma theory ran parallel to the humoral framework, and in some ways it was the more dangerous of the two, not because it was more wrong, but because it directed attention and resources toward a completely imaginary threat, while the real one went unaddressed. Miasma was the corrupted air, the bad air, malaria in the Italian, that would eventually give malaria its name, though that was a different disease and a different misunderstanding. The physicians and scholars of the 14th century believed that certain configurations of atmosphere, the rotting of organic matter, the stagnation of water, unusual celestial events, the conjunction of unfavorable planets, could produce a poisoned air that, when inhaled, corrupted the body's humors and induced disease. The logic was not without its observations. In cities where the air smelled foul, where the sewers ran open in the streets, where the slaughterhouses discharged into the rivers, where the accumulated waste of dense human habitation produced a pervasive and nauseating stench, were indeed sicker cities, not because of the smell itself, but because the conditions that produced the smell were also the conditions that produced the rats and fleas that carried Yersinia pestis. The medieval physician could see the correlation between stench and sickness perfectly clearly. He had simply drawn the wrong conclusion from it. And so the remedies for miasma were olfactory, aromatic. The idea was that good smells would counteract or displace the bad air that was making people sick. Physicians carried nosegays of flowers pressed to their faces when they walked through infected streets. Bundles of lavender, rosemary, mint, dried roses, whatever was fragrant and available. Wealthy households burned aromatic herbs constantly, juniper, pine, cypress, filling their rooms with smoke in the belief that the smoke would purify the air. Some physicians recommended that patients sit as close as possible to the largest, hottest fire they could build, on the theory that the intense heat would drive out the pestilential vapors. Others, with a logic that is almost admirable in its commitment to the premise, recommended sitting near an open sewer, on the grounds that the bad air of the plague would be drawn toward the worse air of the cesspit, leaving the patient's vicinity cleaner. There was also the smelling apple, a small, on-hand held pomander made of wax or clay, packed with pepper, sandalwood, cloves, camphor, gum arabic, molded into a sphere the size of a fist, carried in the pocket and pressed to the nose whenever one ventured into public. This was not merely folk remedy. This was the advised preventive measure of trained professionals. Pope Clement VI, presiding over the Avignon papacy from his palace in southern France, was advised by his physicians to sit between two enormous fires at all times, so that the heat and smoke would form a protective barrier of clean air around him. He followed this advice. He survived the plague. His physicians noted this as a confirmation of the theory. It was not. He survived because he stayed isolated in a stone palace, far from the fleas and the rats and the dying crowds of his city. The fires were irrelevant, but the physicians had no framework to understand isolation as the relevant variable, so they attributed his survival to the fires. And the theory was reinforced, and the nose gaze and the smelling apples and the juniper smoke continued. Among the specific treatments prescribed for those who had already contracted the plague, there exists a catalogue that reads, 7 centuries later, like a document from another species entirely. Gentile da Foligno was a prominent physician in 14th century Italy, a respected academic with a reputation for careful scholarship, a man whose opinion was sought and trusted by his peers. He devoted his final weeks to studying the plague and compiling his recommendations. He died of it in 1348. Before he died, he prescribed, with complete professional confidence, a salve to be applied to the buboes is intended to draw out the corrupt matter and reduce the swelling. The recipe called for the root of white lily, the extract of an umbelliferous plant from the parsley family, and human excrement. The patient's own excrement, if available. This was not quackery. This was the output of a trained, credentialed, sincerely motivated physician doing his best with the tools and knowledge available to him. That the tools were wrong, and the knowledge was wrong, and the salve thus produced would have introduced additional bacteria into already compromised tissue and hastened the patient's death. None of this was knowable to Gentile da Foligno. He was working with everything he had. Then there was the Vicary method, named for Thomas Vicary, an English physician who propagated a treatment that became sufficiently widespread to bear recording. And it involved catching a live chicken, plucking the feathers from its hindquarters, and binding the bare rump of the chicken directly against the patient's bubo. The logic was sympathetic. The heat and vital energy of the living bird would draw the poison out of the swelling and into the chicken. When the chicken died, which it sometimes did, presumably from ordinary causes, or from the stress of the procedure, or from exposure to the infected tissue, this was taken as evidence that the treatment was working. The poison had transferred. A new chicken would be procured and applied. People submitted to this treatment. Parents requested it for their children. Not because they were credulous beyond reason, but because a physician had recommended it, and physicians were the educated authorities of their world. And when you are watching your child die, and someone with credentials and a solemn face tells you there is something to be done, you do it. You do anything. You would do anything. Crushed gemstones were prescribed as internal remedies. Emeralds and rubies and sapphires ground to powder and mixed into wine, on the theory that the purity and celestial associations of precious stones could counteract the corrupted matter in the blood. This was a luxury treatment, available only to the very wealthy, and it killed them just as efficiently as the cheaper remedies killed everyone else. And then there were the plague doctors themselves, the ones with the masks, the beaked plague doctor costume, the long black robe, the wide-brimmed hat, the leather gloves and boots, the glass eyepieces, the long wooden cane, and above all, the extraordinary beaked mask, 6 inches of curved leather filled with aromatic herbs, is one of the most recognizable images to survive from this period of history. It has become almost an emblem of the era, reproduced endlessly, instantly legible across 7 centuries, as shorthand for death and pestilence and the medieval dark. The costume was not, in fact, designed during the Black Death of 1347. It was described and codified nearly 3 centuries later by a French physician named Charles de Lorme, who served as personal physician to 3 French kings in the early 17th century. He was designing protective equipment for physicians attending plague patients, working from the same miasma theory that had guided the physicians of 1347 and producing the same result. The beak was packed with herbs, mint, cloves, myrrh, camphor, laudanum, to filter the bad air. The leather suit and gloves were meant to prevent skin contact with the corrupted atmosphere. The glass eyepieces prevented the miasma from entering through the eyes. The long cane allowed the physician to examine patients without touching them. It was a sincere attempt to create a rational protective protocol. It was also, of course, completely wrong about the mechanism of disease. The herbs in the beak filtered nothing. The leather suit provided no meaningful barrier to bacteria. The glass eyepieces were irrelevant. The only element of the entire costume that had any genuine protective value was the wooden cane. Not because it filtered anything, but because it kept the physician at a physical distance from the patient's coughing. And distance was the one thing that actually reduced exposure to pneumonic plague. The physicians who wore this costume did not know that. They believed they were protected by the herbs and the leather and the glass. And they walked into plague wards, into the homes of the dying, into the mass graves and the charnel houses, with the absolute certainty of people who believed they understood what was happening. Most of them died. Guy de Chauliac was personal physician to Pope Clement VI, the same pope of the 2 great fires, and he was the most distinguished medical authority in Europe in 1348. He contracted the plague himself. He survived it, which was unusual enough to become the subject of considerable commentary. And in his great medical treatise, the Inventarium Chirurgia Magna, he wrote something that deserves to be read slowly, in the dark, because it is the confession of a brilliant man confronting the absolute limits of his brilliance. He wrote that the plague was shameful for the physicians who could give no help at all, that out of fear of infection they hesitated to visit the sick, that even if they did visit, they achieved nothing, that everyone who contracted the plague died, except for a very few toward the end who escaped after the buboes had ripened and burst. He wrote this not with bitterness, but with a kind of stunned, exhausted honesty. The most respected physician in Europe, the man with the most prestigious patient, the most extensive training, the most complete command of the medical knowledge of his age. And he was saying plainly that none of it had mattered, that the plague had walked past everything they knew and everything they could do, as if their knowledge were made of smoke. It was. In a sense, it was. There is something in that admission, in the willingness to write it down, to preserve it, to hand it forward to whoever would read it in the centuries to come. That feels important. It is not the admission of a fraud exposed or a coward retreating. It is the admission of a person who has looked at the edge of human knowledge and found it, in this case, catastrophically short of what was needed. It is a document of epistemic humility, written in the middle of a catastrophe that made epistemic humility the only honest response. The physicians could not save the dying. The medicine could not explain the disease. The stars were not the cause, and the smelling apples were not the cure, and the crushed emeralds did nothing, and the chickens died for nothing, and the leeches weakened the already weakened, and the fires burned in the Avignon palace, while the city outside died in the streets. And into the vacuum that this failure left, into the space where answers should have been, where comfort should have been, where the assurance that someone understood and someone was in control should have been, something else rushed in, something born of absolute terror and absolute helplessness, something that would take the private despair of the individual and make it public, make it theatrical, make it bleed. The physicians had tried, the physicians had failed, and now, moving across the roads of Germany and Hungary and the Low Countries, coming into view of the exhausted and the grieving and the terrified, the Flagellants were coming, with their white robes and their iron-tipped whips, and their conviction that if God could not be reasoned with, perhaps God could be bled for. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with screaming or with the dramatic collapse of things. It comes quietly. It settles into the ordinary fabric of daily life, like cold water rising through the floorboards, slowly, steadily, without warning, until you look down and find that the floor you were standing on is gone, and that you have been standing on nothing for some time without realizing it. This is what the Black Death did to the psychology of Europe. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic moment, but incrementally, over months and then years, it dismantled the structures, social, spiritual, emotional, that people had built their lives upon. The neighbor you called on in difficulty was sick. The priest you confessed to had died. The physician you trusted had nothing to offer. The God you had prayed to every morning and every evening of your entire life was, by any observable measure, not responding. The floor was gone, and when the floor is gone and the water keeps rising, people do not simply float in quiet resignation. They reach, they grasp, they build what they can from whatever remains. And sometimes what they build is extraordinary in its tenderness and its courage. And sometimes what they build is something else entirely. Begin with the smallest scale. Begin with a single family, the Decameron, Boccaccio's great work, written in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death, opens with a description of Florence in the spring of 1348 that has never been equaled for its quiet precision. He writes not of the dying, though the dying is everywhere in it, but of the behavior of the living, and what he observed with the careful eye of a man who understood that he was watching something that needed to be preserved in language before it was lost to time, was the dissolution of the most fundamental human bonds. He wrote of parents who refused to visit their sick children, of children who refused to visit their sick parents, of husbands who abandoned wives, wives who abandoned husbands at the first appearance of the black swellings. He was careful, as noted before, not to condemn. He understood it. The disease was so contagious, or seemed so contagious, to people who had no framework for distinguishing between the bubonic and pneumonic forms, that proximity to the sick had become, in the minds of the healthy, too equivalent to proximity to death itself. And so people made choices that under any ordinary circumstance of human life, they would have found unthinkable. A mother looked at her child with the first swellings appearing at the neck, and she made a calculation. And the calculation produced an answer that she would carry for the rest of her life, however long that was in 1348, however few or many years remained to her. And that answer was, I cannot go near, I cannot touch, I cannot help. The houses of the sick were sealed, not always by force, not always by the authorities, sometimes simply by the quiet agreement of the street, the unspoken consensus of the neighbors. A door, marked with a cross, a window from which no sound came. Inside, the sick were sometimes alone. Sometimes there was one person, usually the poorest member of the household, a servant or a hired carer, someone with no other option, who remained to tend to them. These people, the ones who stayed when everyone else left, died at extraordinary rates. Their names are almost never recorded. Children were locked in their rooms while their parents lay dying in the next one. Parents locked sick children away and stood on the other side of the door and listened. What they heard on those nights, in those houses, the people who survived and wrote about it almost uniformly declined to describe in detail. Some things, even the most honest chroniclers decided, did not need to be transmitted to the future. The silence on the other side of the locked door was enough. The implication was sufficient. Agnolo di Tura, the Sienese chronicler who buried his 5 children, wrote that the dead were buried so superficially that the dogs dug them up and ate them. He wrote this in the same tone he used to record grain prices and municipal appointments. The matter-of-factness of it is more devastating than any rhetorical flourish could be. It had simply become, in Siena in 1348, an ordinary fact of life. The dogs were eating the dead. This was something that happened now. This was part of the texture of the world. In this atmosphere, this landscape of private dread, of sealed houses and silent streets and bells that had stopped ringing, there arrived, in 1348, a movement that would become one of the most extraordinary mass psychological phenomena in European history, the Flagellants. They came from Austria first, and then from Hungary, and then from Germany. Though later accounts place early outbreaks in various locations simultaneously, as if the same desperate impulse had erupted independently in multiple places at once, like fires igniting across a dry landscape. They called themselves, in some regions, the Brethren of the Cross. They organized themselves into groups of varying size, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, sometimes, at the movement's peak, thousands. They wore white robes with a red cross marked on the front and back. They carried banners. They moved from town to town along the roads of Europe. With the disciplined purposefulness of an army, they were performing penance on behalf of all humanity. The theological logic was not, in the context of 1348, irrational. If God had sent the plague as punishment for the sins of mankind, and this was the dominant interpretation among religious people across Europe, the obvious conclusion, if you believed in a God who intervened in human affairs and who required righteousness from his creation, then the appropriate response was penitence, confession, atonement. The Church provided these sacraments as it had always done. But the Church was overwhelmed and the priests were dying, and the ordinary channels of divine mercy seemed, to more and more people, hopelessly inadequate to the scale of what was being punished. The Flagellants proposed something more direct, more immediate. more visceral. If ordinary confession was insufficient for ordinary sin, perhaps extraordinary suffering was required for the extraordinary sin that had provoked this catastrophe. If the Church's intercessions were not reaching God, perhaps God could be reached directly through the body, through blood. The ritual that the Flagellants performed as they traveled has been described by multiple eyewitnesses in multiple countries, and the descriptions are consistent enough to reconstruct. When a group arrived in a town, and their arrival was announced in advance so that the townspeople gathered, they would process to an open space, a churchyard, a market square, the fields outside the walls. They would form a circle, and then, at a signal from their leader, the master, they would strip to the waist. They would lie face down on the ground in the posture of the crucifixion, arms outstretched, cheeks against the earth. Those who had specific sins requiring specific postures would arrange themselves accordingly. An adulterer lay face down. A perjurer lay on his side with 3 fingers raised. They lay there in silence while the master walked among them, and then, at another signal, they rose, and they began. Each member carried a personal scourge, a whip of 3 or 4 leather thongs, each thong knotted at intervals with iron studs or iron points. The contemporary historian Henry of Hereford, who witnessed the flagellant processions and recorded what he saw, described the whips in detail that he clearly felt was necessary for the historical record, however difficult it was to write. Each scourge, he noted, was designed not merely to cause pain, but to cause wounds. The iron points were angled to tear the skin on the upswing as well as the downswing. The wounds thus produced were not symbolic. They bled freely. The Flagellants beat themselves rhythmically, in unison, moving in their circle, singing as they went. The Geisler Lieder, the Flagellant songs, were simple, repetitive, call and response compositions in the vernacular, songs of lamentation and supplication. The leader would sing a verse and the group would respond in unison, their voices rising over the sound of the whips and the sound of the wounds they were making. They sang of Christ's suffering, they sang of human sin, they sang of the plague as God's righteous anger, and of their own bodies as the instruments of propitiation. The performance went on for hours. Some accounts describe it continuing until the participants could barely stand. And the crowds that gathered to watch were not primarily horrified. Many of them were moved, deeply, viscerally moved. They wept. Some joined the procession on the spot, stripping to the waist and taking a whip from the supply that the group carried for new members. The Flagellants accepted them. The movement grew as it traveled, from dozens to hundreds to thousands. By the middle of 1349, it had spread from Germany to Hungary, to Poland, to Flanders, to the Low Countries, and groups had reached England. A single crusade rolled into the city of Constance in southern Germany with 42,000 followers. They were not, it must be understood, a fringe. They were not marginal zealots whom ordinary people watched with bewildered distance. They were the desperate faithful of a Europe in which everything that was supposed to work had failed to work. The medicine had failed. The church's prayers had failed. The government's quarantines had failed. And God was not responding through the normal channels. The Flagellants were trying something else, and many people watching them thought, perhaps this is what it takes. Pope Clement VI, safely behind his fires in Avignon, watched the movement with increasing alarm. It was not primarily the self-harm that concerned him. It was the implications. The Flagellants, in their theology and their practice, were circumventing the church entirely. They were offering absolution outside of the sacramental structure. Their leaders were claiming the authority to forgive sins, an authority that the church reserved exclusively for ordained priests. They were, in short, on a spiritual rebellion, a mass movement that was drawing people's religious energies away from the institution that depended on those energies for its authority and its power. On the 20th of October, 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull formally condemning the Flagellant movement. He declared them heretics. He ordered church authorities throughout Europe to suppress them. Secular rulers followed. The King of France moved against them. Manfred of Sicily threatened to hang any flagellant who entered his territory. A bishop in Breslau had one of their leaders burned alive. Hundreds were imprisoned, tortured, executed. The movement collapsed with nearly the same speed at which it had emerged. By 1350, the great processions had largely ceased. The roads that had echoed with the flagellant songs went quiet again. But the flagellants were not the worst of what the terror produced. They were, at least, directing their violence inward, against themselves. There was another response to the plague, one that directed its violence outward, toward the most vulnerable people available, with a fury that dwarfs even the darkest moments of the flagellant movement in its systematic, organized brutality, the Jews of Europe. The logic of the scapegoat has a terrible clarity in conditions of mass fear. Someone is responsible. Someone must be responsible, because the alternative, that this is happening for no reason, that this is not punishment for anything, that there is no moral ledger in which this suffering is being tallied against some corresponding sin, is a kind of madness that many people in 1348 could not sustain, and so the mind looks for a cause. And in medieval Europe, the Jews had long occupied the particular social position of the designated other. Tolerated in good times, suspect in difficult ones, blamed in catastrophic ones. The accusation that spread across Europe in 1348 and 1349 was specific. The Jews had poisoned the wells. They had introduced the plague deliberately into Christian water supplies as part of a conspiracy against Christendom. There was no evidence for this. There could not have been evidence for this because it was not true. Yersinia pestis does not live in wells. The plague was not being spread through water. Jewish communities were dying from it at the same rates as Christian ones, sometimes at higher rates, because the dense urban neighborhoods in which Jews were typically confined by law created ideal conditions for flea transmission. None of this mattered. In November of 1348, Jews were rounded up and burned alive at Solothurn, at Buren, at Memmingen, at Lindau, in December at Landsberg, in January 1349 at Freiburg. In February of 1349, in Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive on a single day, the 14th of February. 2,000 people on a single day in a single city. The chronicler of Strasbourg recorded the event without apparent horror, in the same tone used to record a market day or a municipal election. The Jews, he wrote, were burned on a wooden platform constructed for the purpose in their own cemetery. They were given the option of conversion. Those who converted were spared. Most did not convert. The fire was lit. Throughout Germany and Central Europe, in the months surrounding that February, the pattern repeated. Cologne, Mainz, Frankfurt, town after town, and the Germania Judaica. a historical compilation drawn from archives across Germany, Austria, and Central Europe, records that plague-driven pogroms destroyed at least 235 Jewish communities across the region alone. Entire communities. Not just individuals, entire communities. Pope Clement VI, the same man who would soon condemn the Flagellants, issued not one, but two papal bulls expressly forbidding the persecution of Jews. He noted, with an exactness that his contemporaries apparently found unpersuasive, that Jewish communities were dying from the plague at the same rates as everyone else, which made the accusation of deliberate poisoning logically incoherent. The bulls were largely ignored. The fires continued. And through all of this, the sealed houses and the abandoned children, as the white-robed processions and the iron-tipped whips, the burning and the silence and the bells that had stopped ringing, the plague moved on, indifferent to all of it. Yersinia Pestis did not distinguish between the flagellant and the Jew and the physician and the Pope. It did not pause for the papal bulls or the 42,000 gathered at Constance. It moved through the bodies of the faithful and the faithless with equal efficiency, doing what it had always done in the dark and the fur and the blood of the flea. The bacterium had no malice, as we noted in the earliest hours of this night, but the fear it created had malice in abundance. The fear moved through human beings the way the bacteria moved through the body, entering through a wound that was already there, finding the existing structures, as the existing tensions and suspicions and vulnerabilities, and amplifying them until they ruptured. This is something worth sitting with quietly, in the dark. The disease itself was neutral. What it revealed about the people it passed through was not always neutral. It showed acts of extraordinary courage. The priests who stayed when the prudent ones fled, the carers who remained when the families left, the physicians who kept visiting the sick, knowing they would almost certainly die for it. And it showed something else. The 2,000 burned in Strasbourg on a February morning, the children locked behind doors, the bodies left in the streets for the dogs. Both were real. Both were human. Both belonged to the same story. The plague did not turn Europe into a graveyard only in the physical sense. It turned something inward as well. It excavated the interior of a civilization and exposed what was there in the foundations, beneath the prayers and the guild halls and the cathedrals and the philosophy. What was there, as there always is, was both more beautiful and more terrible than the surface suggested. By 1350, the first great wave was beginning to recede. The dying slowed. The mass graves stopped filling quite so quickly. A few spring mornings arrived that did not begin with the sound of carts collecting bodies. People emerged from houses they had been afraid to leave. They blinked in the pale light and looked at the streets of their cities. Quieter cities, half-empty cities, cities where every second house seemed to hold a silence instead of a family. And they began slowly, carefully, as human beings always do, to ask what came next. What came next we will speak of in the passage ahead, the strange, unexpected, almost impossible things that grew from the silence, the first quarantines, the fracturing of feudalism, the beginning of the long, slow turn toward a different kind of world. But for now, the fire is low, the night is deep. Rest if you can. We have come through the worst of it. There is a moment after a very great storm when the world goes still, not peaceful, not yet. The trees are broken, the roads are flooded, The sky is the pale, washed-out color of exhaustion. But the wind has stopped, the rain has stopped. And for the first time in what feels like a very long time, you can hear the ordinary sounds again. Water dripping from eaves, a bird somewhere, the distant creak of something settling. And the world is damaged beyond quick repair. But it is at least quiet now. And in the quiet, something can begin. The years after 1350 in Europe were this kind of quiet, not peace, not recovery in any simple sense. The plague did not end in 1350. It would return in waves throughout the 14th and 15th centuries and beyond, erupting again in 1361, in 1369, in 1374. Each recurrence killing fresh populations that had been born after the previous wave and had no inherited resistance. The silence of the post-plague world was not the silence of safety. It was the silence of a continent that had lost, in 5 years, between a third and a half of every person alive in it, and was now standing in the aftermath, looking at what remained, trying to understand what kind of world could be built from the ruins. What was built over the decades that followed was strange, unexpected in some of its forms. Almost impossible to have predicted from the depths of 1348, because the Black Death did not simply destroy. It destroyed with a kind of terrible impartiality that made it, paradoxically, a force for transformation as well as devastation. The old world that it swept through was not a just world. It was not an equal world. It was a world built on the labor of people who had almost no power to refuse that labor, no ability to demand better conditions, no leverage to exercise against the structures that held them in place. The plague gave them leverage. It gave them leverage because it killed them in such numbers that the ones who survived became suddenly, extraordinarily scarce. And scarcity in an economy built on human labor changes everything. Begin with the numbers, because the numbers are the foundation of everything that followed. By 1350, Europe had lost somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. Historians debate the upper end of that range, but the lower end is not seriously disputed. In England, the population in 1400 was approximately half what it had been in 1300. And this figure accounts not just for the first wave, but for the subsequent recurrences that continued to depress the population across the second half of the 14th century. In France, which had been the most populous country in Western Europe before the Black Death, the loss was comparable. In the Mediterranean world, Italy, Spain, the Levant, Egypt, the mortality was sometimes even higher. Cairo, in which had numbered as many as 600,000 people before the plague, and had been possibly the largest city west of China, lost between a third and 40% of its population within 8 months. These numbers represent, in a very literal sense, the disappearance of a way of life. The medieval economy was built on the manor, on the feudal relationship between the lord who owned the land and the serfs who worked it. The serfs, the villains, the bondsmen, the unfree tenants who made up the majority of the rural population, were bound to their lord's land. They could not leave without permission. They could not refuse to work. They owed labor and rent and a portion of their harvest in exchange for the theoretical protection of their lord. And the exchange was not negotiable because the serfs had nothing to negotiate with. And the lords had land, law, weapons, and complete economic leverage. The serfs had their labor, and labor before 1347 was abundant. After 1350, it was not. In the villages and manors that survived, the ones that still had living tenants, which was not all of them, the lords who emerged from the plague years found themselves in a position that would have seemed inconceivable to their fathers. They needed workers. They needed them desperately. Their fields were overgrown. Their livestock had scattered or died untended. Their harvests were rotting for want of hands to bring them in. And the workers, the surviving serfs, the living laborers, the people who had come through the dying, looked at this situation and understood something that the structure of medieval society had never before permitted them to understand. They were needed. They began to demand wages, not for symbolic reasons, not out of ideology, but out of pure economic logic. Because if one lord would not pay them, another lord, equally desperate, equally short of labor, equally faced with fields that needed tending, would. They began to move between manors, seeking better terms. They began to refuse obligations that their parents had accepted without question. The bonds of serfdom, which had always depended ultimately on the inability of the serf to go elsewhere, began to fray. Not everywhere, and not overnight. In some parts of Europe, the lords responded to the labor shortage by attempting to tighten their grip, by passing laws fixing wages at pre-plague levels, by increasing penalties for leaving the land without permission, or by using every legal and physical instrument of coercion available to them. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages and compel workers to accept the same terms they had accepted before the plague. It did not work. The workers walked away anyway. The wages rose anyway. In some areas, according to the records that survive, rents that had previously brought £5 now brought £1. The economic value of land, without the labor to work it, was almost nothing. And the people who provided the labor knew this and acted accordingly. The process was slow, uneven, contested at every step by the people who stood to lose from it. But it was real. The plague did not end feudalism, but it broke something in feudalism that had never healed completely. It introduced into the structure a leverage point that had not existed before, and that leverage point, over the following century and a half, would contribute to the gradual dissolution of the medieval social order. The church fared no better than the feudal system. In some ways, it fared worse. The Roman Catholic Church in the mid-14th century was the most powerful institution in Europe. Its authority touched every aspect of life: birth, marriage, death, the ownership of property, the conduct of war, the salvation of the soul. It had answers for everything. It had a complete metaphysical framework within which every human experience could be interpreted and every human fear could be addressed. It had priests in every village, bishops in every city, in the Pope in his palace in Avignon, and 7 centuries of accumulated theological certainty to draw upon. And then the plague came, and it had no answer. The priests died. They died at rates that sometimes exceeded the general population, because their vocation required them to go near the sick, to administer last rites, to sit at deathbeds, to touch the dying. The monasteries were devastated. Whole religious communities were wiped out. In some dioceses, the loss of trained clergy was so severe that the church struggled to replace them, and replacements were hastily ordained, inadequately trained, young men elevated to positions of authority, before they had the knowledge or the spiritual formation to exercise it properly. The institutional quality of the church in the immediate post-plague decades declined sharply, but the more damaging wound was not institutional. It was theological. People had prayed. They had prayed with complete sincerity, with their whole lives, every day of those terrible years. They had processed through the streets carrying relics and statues. They had confessed their sins and received absolution and gone home and died anyway. The church had told them, in its theology of divine punishment, that the plague was God's response to human sinfulness. And the logical implication of this was that sufficient repentance would cause God to relent. But he had not relented. The prayers had not stopped the dying. The processions had not stopped the dying. The absolutions had not stopped the dying. And the question that this raised, quiet, persistent, impossible to fully suppress, was one that the church was not well equipped to answer. And if God had sent this, and the church's intercessions could not stop it, what exactly was the church for? Not everyone asked this question. Many people responded to the plague with intensified devotion, a deepened and more personal engagement with their faith, finding in the wreckage of the institutional church a more direct and immediate relationship with the divine. Mysticism flourished in the post-plague decades, the cultivation of an interior spiritual life, independent of the institutional framework, seeking God through direct contemplative experience rather than through the sacramental mediation of the clergy. The Rhineland mystics, the brethren of the common life, later the movement that would become the Devotio Moderna. These were not simply intellectual movements. They were spiritual responses to a crisis of institutional authority. They were people looking for God in a different place, because the place they had always looked had, during the plague years, seemed to be empty. And beyond mysticism, the seeds of something more disruptive were being planted. The heretical movements that had been suppressed or contained before the Black Death began to find more fertile ground in the post-plague world. The church's authority, visibly diminished, visibly incapable of protecting its flock, visibly occupied with its own survival, was easier to question than it had been before. The cracks that the plague opened in the church's credibility would take another century and a half to produce the fracture that historians call the Reformation. But the plague was there, in the beginning of that fracture. In the quiet, the doubt had taken root. From the ruins of theory and authority, one practical thing emerged that would outlast both the plague and the civilization that produced it. One genuine, lasting contribution to human survival, born directly from the desperate improvisation of cities trying to stop what they could not understand. Quarantine. The city of Venice, which had been one of the first major European cities to fall to the plague, and which, as a great maritime trading power, had more reason than most to think carefully about what arrived on ships, began as early as 1348 to require that vessels arriving from infected regions anchor offshore before their passengers and cargo could land. The initial isolation period was 30 days. By 1377, the Republic of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, had formalized a 30-day isolation requirement into law. Venice extended its period to 40 days. 40 days. 40 giorni in Italian. This is where the word quarantine comes from 40 days of waiting. From the measured empirical observation, arrived at without any understanding of bacteria or incubation periods or germ theory, that if you kept new arrivals isolated for long enough, the sick ones would declare themselves and the healthy ones could enter safely. It was the right answer, arrived at by the wrong reasoning. The Venetians were still operating within the miasma framework. They believed they were preventing the corrupted air of infected ships from mingling with the clean air of the city. They did not know about Yersinia pestis. They did not know about fleas or rats or lymph nodes. But they had observed correctly that isolation worked. That distance between the potentially infected and the general population reduced the spread of the disease, and they had institutionalized that observation into law and procedure. This was, in its way, the first modern public health measure. Imperfect, imperfectly understood, applied with a logic that was entirely wrong about mechanism while being entirely right about outcome. But it was a beginning, a first step, stumbling, groping in the dark, but a step in the right direction, toward the understanding that would, 6 centuries later, give the world the tools to face exactly this kind of catastrophe with something other than nosegays and astrological charts. The art of Europe changed, and this is perhaps the most visible legacy of the Black Death in the physical record that survives. The way that the plague altered what European artists made and how they thought about what they were making. Before 1347, the dominant imagery of European religious art was hierarchical, formal, ordered. Christ in majesty, the Virgin enthroned, the saints arranged in the golden geometry of eternity. Death was present in medieval art, as it is present in any culture's art, but it was processed, controlled, contained within theological frameworks that gave it meaning and dignity. After 1350, something shifted. The danse macabre, the dance of death, emerged as one of the defining images of the post-plague decades. Paintings and engravings showing skeletal figures of death leading processions of the living, pope and emperor, and a bishop and merchant, knight and peasant, all dancing together toward the same inevitable end. The genius of the danse macabre was its democracy. Death did not discriminate. Death took the pope and the peasant in the same procession, with the same grim equality, and this image, death as the great leveler, indifferent to rank, indifferent to wealth, indifferent to piety, resonated with a population that had just watched the plague demonstrate exactly this truth. The painters Ambrogio and Pietro Lorenzetti, whose work represented one of the heights of early Italian painting, both died in Siena in 1348. Their deaths, and the deaths of dozens of other artists and craftsmen and scholars across Europe, created cultural lacunae, gaps in the transmission of artistic tradition that took decades to fill, and the development of the Florentine school, which was moving toward the innovations that would eventually produce the Renaissance, was interrupted. Not stopped permanently, but interrupted, diverted, changed. What grew back was not identical to what had been there before. It was sadder in some ways, more preoccupied with mortality, more interested in the individual body and its vulnerability, more willing to look at death directly, without the mitigating comfort of theological certainty. These are the qualities that some historians trace, in part, to the experience of a generation that had watched half its world die in 5 years. A generation for whom death was not an abstraction to be managed by the Church, but a fact so close and so recent and so random that the only honest response to it was to look at it without flinching. The world that began to reassemble itself after 1350 was not the world that had existed before. The population would not recover to pre-plague levels for a century and a half. The Church would never fully recover the authority it had lost. The feudal system would continue its slow dissolution. The quarantine would remain a permanent addition to the human toolkit for survival. The art would carry, in its new preoccupation with mortality and the individual, the seeds of a different way of understanding what it meant to be a human being alive in an uncertain world. All of this from 12 ships, from a flea, from a bacterium with no mind and no malice, and no awareness that it had changed the course of history. There is one final thing to speak of tonight, the most intimate thing of all, on something the plague left, not in the historical record, not in the art or the institutions or the laws, but in something far more personal, far more enduring. It left something in the body, in the blood and the bone, and the coded instructions of the cells of the people lying quietly in the dark right now, in the countries that were Europe, in the descendants of those who survived. That story, the quietest and perhaps the most extraordinary of all, belongs to the last passage of this night. Consider for a moment the person lying in the dark right now, not as a historical subject, not as a datum in a population study, or a name in a register, or a number in the long arithmetic of mortality that we have been tracing through these hours, but as a body, a warm, breathing, living body, in a bed, in a room, in a building, in a city or a town or a village that exists in the part of the world that was 7 centuries ago the epicenter of the greatest biological catastrophe in recorded human history. Consider what is inside that body, inside every cell, every one of the approximately 37 trillion cells that constitute a living human being. There is a complete copy of that person's genome. 3 billion base pairs of DNA coiled into chromosomes, encoding every instruction the body needs to build and maintain itself. Most of that genome is ancient beyond comprehension, shared with organisms that lived before the first human being stood upright on the African savanna, shared in significant portions, even with the trees and the grass, and the quiet organisms in the soil beneath them. But some of it is more recent. Some of it was written, or rewritten, within the last 1,000 years, within the last few centuries, by exactly the kind of event we have been describing tonight. The plague did not only move through the populations of medieval Europe, it moved through the genome. In the summer of 1665, 3 centuries after the first ships docked at Messina, in the second great pandemic wave that historians call the Great Plague of London, a small package arrived in the village of Eyam in Derbyshire, a bolt of cloth sent from London to a local tailor named George Vicars. The cloth was damp. It had been stored badly during the journey. Vicars hung it out to dry by the fire. Within days, he was covered in swellings. Within a week, he was dead. Eyam, at that time, was a village of perhaps 700 people, a small or quiet community in the limestone hills of the Peak District. Miners and farmers, a church, a handful of streets, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and had known them for generations. The plague had arrived in their bolt of cloth, in the fleas that had sheltered in its fibers during the journey from the infected city. What happened next is one of the most remarkable decisions in the history of public health. The rector of Eyam, William Mompesson, and the former rector, Thomas Stanley, persuaded the villagers to quarantine themselves voluntarily, to seal Eyam off from the surrounding countryside, to allow no one in and no one out, so that the plague wouldn't spread to the neighboring towns and villages. Food and supplies were left at the boundary stones on the edge of the village. Money soaked in vinegar. in the belief, and he rooted in miasma theory, that the vinegar would neutralize any contamination, was left in exchange. Ayam stayed sealed for 14 months. By the time the plague had run its course, 260 of the village's approximately 350 households had lost at least one member. The total dead numbered around 250, more than a third of the entire village. Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and all 6 of her children in the space of 8 days, carrying each body to a field above the village herself, because there was no one to help her. William Mompesson's wife, Catherine, died in August of 1666. Mompesson himself survived. He never fully understood why. The people who survived the plague at Ayam, the ones who were exposed repeatedly, across 14 months of living inside a sealed village with an active plague outbreak, and who did not die, represented a puzzle that their descendants carried forward for 3 centuries without knowing they were carrying it. They had survived. They had survived when survival seemed improbable. They had survived when people far younger and healthier than them had not. And they had had children, and those children had had children, and the generations had accumulated in the limestone hills of Derbyshire, inheriting without knowing it whatever it was that had kept their ancestors alive. In 1996, scientists studying the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, made a discovery that seemed at first to have nothing to do with the Black Death. They found a mutation on chromosome 3 of the human genome, the same chromosome that carries hundreds of other genes, unremarkable in most respects. There is a gene that codes for a protein called CCR5. This protein sits on the surface of certain immune cells, the T cells, and functions as a receptor, a docking port, in effect, for specific chemical signals. It is part of the normal machinery of the immune system. Most people have a fully functional CCR5 receptor, and it works as expected, and they never think about it. But in approximately 10% of people of European descent, there is a variation in this gene, a deletion, a small section of 32 base pairs missing from the gene sequence. This variation is called CCR5 delta 32, and what it produces in those who carry it is a CCR5 receptor so malformed that it no longer functions as a receptor at all. The protein is produced, but it cannot do its job. The docking port is broken. For most purposes, this does not matter. The CCR5 receptor is, in the normal course of human life, somewhat redundant. The immune system has other mechanisms, and the loss of this one does not appear to cause any significant health problems in most people who carry the mutation. But HIV needs CCR5. The virus uses the CCR5 receptor as its primary point of entry into the immune cell. It docks at CCR5, and through that docking, it gains access to the cell's interior and begins its replication and initiates the cascade that eventually destroys the immune system. In people who carry 2 copies of the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, one on each chromosome and inherited from both parents, the receptor is absent. HIV cannot dock. HIV cannot enter. These people are, for all practical purposes, immune to HIV infection. This was a significant discovery. It was immediately, urgently significant for medicine, for the development of HIV treatments, for the possibility of therapies that might protect people who did not have the natural mutation by pharmacologically blocking the CCR5 receptor in the same way. 2 copies of CCR5 delta 32, complete immunity to HIV. 1 copy, significantly slowed disease progression. But the discovery raised an immediate question, a question that sent scientists not forward toward future treatments, but backward toward the past. The CCR5 Delta 32 mutation exists today at appreciable frequencies only in people of European descent. Within Europe, its frequency increases as you move north. It is more common in Scandinavia, in northern Germany, in Britain, than it is in the Mediterranean South. It is rare or absent in most of Africa, most of Asia, most of the rest of the world. And the algorithms of molecular evolutionary theory applied to the mutation's genetic signature suggested that it was relatively young, that it had arisen in the human genome within the last 1,000 years or so, and had spread to its current frequency through strong selective pressure. Something had favored it. Something had made it advantageous to survive. Something had killed, in large enough numbers and over enough generations, the people who did not carry it, until the 10% of Europeans who carry it today represent the amplified descendants of those who did. HIV has not been present long enough to have exerted that selective pressure. The virus was unknown before the 20th century. Something else had done this. Something older. Something that had moved through European populations repeatedly across centuries, selecting ruthlessly for whoever could survive it and against whoever could not. Something that had arrived in 12 ships at a Sicilian harbor in October of 1347. The research team that made this connection turned their attention to Am. The village was ideal for what they needed. It was an isolated population, small, inner geographically contained, with detailed historical records of who had lived there, who had died, who had survived. The descendants of Iam's plague survivors were still there, many of them in the same limestone hills, carrying their ancestors' DNA forward across 3.5 centuries. A documentary team from Channel 4 in Britain, working with scientists from the National Institutes of Health in the United States, traveled to Iam and persuaded more than 90 of the village's current residents, people who could trace their ancestry to the survivors of the 1665 outbreak, to provide DNA samples, simple cheek swabs, a few moments of discomfort, centuries of implication. What they found was suggestive, though not conclusive by the strict standards of statistical significance. The sample was simply too small for certainty. But the direction of the finding was exactly what the theory predicted. The frequency of CCR5 Delta 32 in Iam's descendants was higher than in the surrounding villages. Twice as many homozygous carriers, people with the mutation on both chromosomes, conferring near complete resistance. As in the neighboring populations, the survivors of Am had been, in measurable ways, genetically different from those who died. Now, it is important to be precise here, because this story sits at the edge of what science has confirmed and what it has proposed. The research is ongoing. The relationship between CCR5, Delta 32, and resistance to Yersinia pestis is not fully established. Experiments in mice with the equivalent mutation have produced mixed results, and the exact mechanism by which the deletion might have conferred survival advantage during the plague is still debated. Some scientists argue that the Black Death alone was insufficient to drive the mutation to its current frequency, and that other selective pressures, smallpox perhaps, or other epidemic diseases across the medieval and early modern periods, also played a role. These debates are real, The science is unresolved in its details, but the outline of the story holds. The plague moved through European populations across centuries. The people who survived were not simply lucky. Some of them, some meaningful fraction of them, survived because they carried something in their genome that gave the bacterium slightly less purchase in their cells. That survival advantage was passed forward. It accumulated across generations. And the people who carry CCR5 Delta 32 today are, in some biological sense, the echo of that great dying, carrying in their cells the mark of ancestors who endured something almost unsurvivable and did not quite succumb. There is something worth holding in the mind quietly as this night draws toward its close. 7 centuries have passed since the 12 ships drifted into Messina harbor. The world that received them is gone so completely that it requires scholarship and imagination to reconstruct it. Its sounds, its smells, its pace, the particular quality of its darkness at night, the way the church bells divided the hours. The people who lived in that world are gone. The physicians with their humoral charts and their smelling apples, the Flagellants in their white robes, Agnolo di Tura, who buried his children with his own hands and wrote it down so that someone in the future would know it had happened. Boccaccio, who watched Florence die and wrote the Decameron, which people are still reading. Guy de Chauliac, who confessed that medicine had failed and wrote that confession down too, which may have been the more courageous act of the two. All of them are gone, and yet, the person lying in the dark tonight, in the part of the world that was once medieval Europe, or descended from that world, carrying its genetic inheritance into whatever corner of the earth their family eventually reached, is connected to those people by an unbroken thread. Not metaphorically, not poetically, though it is that too, literally, biologically, in the genome, in the specific sequence of base pairs on chromosome 3, whether the CCR5 gene there is intact or carries the Delta 32 deletion, whether it is the version that survived the plague or the version that came through by sheer fortune, or both in combination, whatever version it is the version that was there in some ancestor, in some moment of those terrible years, and that ancestor lived and continued and eventually arrived through uncountable generations of ordinary human life, here, in this bed, in this darkness, in this body breathing quietly. The night outside is not 1348. The silence tonight is not the silence of a village emptied by plague. There are no carts on the roads. There are no mass graves in the fields. The church bells that ring, if you live within hearing of them, ring the hours because someone is there to ring them. The people in the houses around you are, and in all probability, asleep. The ordinary, unheroic, extraordinarily precious fact of neighbors who are simply asleep and not dead and who will be there in the morning. This is not nothing. It has not always been guaranteed. The Black Death changed the world. It broke things that took centuries to repair, and some things it broke have never been fully reassembled, and perhaps that is not entirely a loss. The feudal system did not deserve repair, and the church's monopoly on spiritual authority was not as complete after the plague as it had been before. And both of those fractures were part of what eventually opened space for different ways of organizing human life and human thought. From the ruins, slowly, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific method, empirical, skeptical, willing to look at what is actually there rather than what the authorities say should be there. The first quarantine at Venice, which is the direct ancestor of every public health measure, that has stood between human populations and the worst that biology can produce. All of this from those 12 ships, all of this from a flea. Yersinia pestis still exists. It lives in the rodent populations of Central Asia, as it always has, and in the prairie dogs of the American Southwest, and in isolated reservoirs in Africa and South America. Between 1,000 and 2,000 people contract plague every year, mostly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Madagascar, in Peru. They are treated with antibiotics, streptomycin, gentamicin, doxycycline, and most of them survive. The bacterium that killed 50 million people in 5 years is now, and in the 21st century, cured with a course of medication. The machine still runs, but we have learned at enormous cost across many centuries how to stop it. There is one more thing, and then this night is done. In the spring of 1349, in the worst of it, the absolute worst, when Paris was burying 800 people a day, and the roads of Germany were full of flagellants, and the fields of England were going fallow for want of hands. There were people who sat with the dying, who did not leave when they could have left, who brought water and changed the bedding, and held the hands of people they had just watched lose everyone they loved, who rang the church bells when everyone else had stopped, who buried the bodies when no one else would bury them, who wrote things down in the ink of their surviving days so that the people of the future, so that you, here now, would know that it had happened and how it had felt and what it had cost. These people existed. They are not famous. Most of them have no names in the historical record. But they were there in the plague years, doing the small, unglamorous, essential work of remaining human under conditions designed to make that impossible. They are your ancestors too, not necessarily in blood, but in the particular inheritance that is harder to trace than DNA, and more important than any mutation on chromosome 3, the inheritance of having been, in the worst circumstances, decent. The inheritance of having looked at the suffering of another person and decided, even knowing the risk, to stay. The night outside is quiet. You are safe, and in a way that the people of 1348 were not safe and would not be safe again for a very long time. The machine has been studied, the bacterium has been named, the flea has been identified, the mechanism has been mapped, in detail that Yersinia pestis cannot evade, by scientists building on 6 centuries of accumulated human understanding. Understanding that began, in its own halting, tragic, wrong-headed way, with the physicians of 1348 who failed and wrote down that they had failed, which was the first honest step toward eventually getting it right. You are the continuation of all of this, of the dying and the surviving, the burying and the rebuilding, the confessing and the questioning, and the slow, painful, magnificent accumulation of knowledge. You carry it in your cells and in your culture, and in the simple fact that you are here, on and alive, and listening. The Black Death is over. The world it made, the fractured, questioning, restless, grief-marked, astonishingly resilient world it made, is the world you live in. Rest now. The night is quiet. You are safe. Good night.